on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. The day that we are recording this program, which is September 2nd, represents the 100-year anniversary of the Battle of Blair Mountain, which we're going to learn about in a moment. But the Battle of Blair Mountain was a turning point in the American labor struggle, and it was an augury and a reflection of powerful labor movement and resistance movement in the Deep South, a place we tend to sometimes misunderstand in the northern and coastal enclaves of this country. So I thought, who better to discuss that with me than my next guest. Keri Leigh Merritt has been on the program a number of times before. I always look forward to speaking with her. She is a historian and writer based in Atlanta, Georgia. She writes about issues of inequality and poverty in the United States, as well as race and class. She has taken the lead role in creating a book, Masterless Men, Poor Whites and Slavery in the Antebellum South. And she joins us now. So first of all, Keri Leigh, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for continuing to do such important work during this crazy time.
Thank you so much. And I hope I didn't get anything wrong in your bio.
All good.
Okay, all right. Well, let's talk about the Battle of Blair Mountain. For those who might not know, what was it?
So the Battle of Blair Mountain is actually a culmination of years and years and years of strife in the West Virginia coal mines. And you have these men, these coal miners, trying to organize, trying to form unions for decades. And when they finally make some inroads into doing so in the early 1920s, they faced really, really bad consequences from their employers. And essentially, I'm sure many of the listeners have heard about the Pinkertons, who in the North served as kind of the private police arm of the employers. Well, in the South, we have something called Baldwin Felts Agency. And I would like to shout out my friend, Bob Hutton, who has written pretty extensively on Baldwin Felts. They are a homegrown Appalachian based, basically police busting, kind of police state arm of these coal companies. And whenever they would try to organize, Baldwin Felts went out and harassed people. They turned them out of their houses. They beat people and eventually killed them. And so what happens with the Battle of Blair Mountain is that these Baldwin Felts agents kill a very popular sheriff. And the mine workers band together and finally start taking their grievances to their bosses and plan this big march to go, say that they're not accepting these working conditions and the violence anymore. And when they start making their way across these West Virginia mountains, basically another sheriff and a bunch of citizens, a bunch of prominent citizens who own property, who own businesses, banded together and hid out in this mountain with machine guns, many of them, homemade bombs, shrapnel, and literally just took out these miners as they were trying to basically embark on a labor rights march, on a movement, on a peaceful movement, and just started picking them off with machine guns. And historians still don't know exactly how many men died in the battle. Low estimates are around 20, high estimates are around 100. But it really, as you said, it marks a big turning point in labor in the U.S.
So when we think about the killing of that sheriff, is that the one that took place in Welch, West Virginia, on the courthouse steps or something? I can't quite recall, but so you had this period. I'm sorry?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Shot down in front of his wife.
Yeah. And so you have people often don't realize how grave these battles were. And so you had these people literally fighting for their lives, many of them being killed in the struggle for union rights. This is happening not in the Northeast, but in the South and in West Virginia. And you have, I think, one of the things that Richard Trumka came on the show several times, and he was very proud of the fact that at least as he told it to me, that the mine workers union, when it first formed, is one of the first multiracial labor organizations. Is that right? Do you know?
It absolutely is. Especially in the South, there tended to be, even in times of good racial relations, there would be a Black organization and a white organization that would meet separately. So absolutely, he's correct.
So this was a bloody battle, began, I believe, on August 25th, 1921, ended September 2nd. What was the immediate outcome and aftermath?
Well, of course, what happened to end the battle was that federal troops had to be sent in. And instead of, going after the people who hid out in the mountain with machine guns to take down these, relatively peaceful marchers, they, of course, went after the coal miners and the people who led the march, calling them insurrectionists, and ended up jailing several of them. And while we see it today as a big forward push in the quest for labor rights, at the time, it actually really wasn't that way on the ground in West Virginia. It actually set back unionization and workers, laborers' rights for really until the New Deal. So for the next, 10, 15 years, there was a real big struggle trying to regain some of this lost ground because, with the combination of violence and literally, the owners owning everything, even the homes of these laborers, they had no other choice.
Well, and Keri Leigh Merritt, I want to at some point move forward to the shift in direction that you're talking about during the New Deal. But if we can just step back to the moment before this conflict took place, and I'm thinking just of the lives of coal miners before the unions came together. As I understand it, they lived in company housing, which was charged against their meager incomes. They were, because they were in remote areas, often not near towns, they purchased their goods, their supplies and food at the company store, which was debited against their paychecks as well, so that they were in a kind of, my sense of it, my impression of it was that they were in a kind of indentured servitude, risking their lives under dangerous conditions, that they really had a very, very rough life. Is that an accurate picture?
Yes, very accurate. I study personally more agricultural people, so I always compare these kind of industrial workers in the South to sharecroppers. In many ways, they're never handed cash. They're never handed, credit that's good for anywhere except for the monopolies owned by the same people that essentially pay their wages. And so they can never get out of debt. They're always, always, always in debt, no matter how hard they work, no matter how many children they put into the job, no matter how many, pregnant wives are on the floor laboring, in these mines, in these factories. It doesn't matter. It's never enough to get out of debt.
And again, we're talking with historian Keri Leigh Merritt about the Battle of Blair Mountain and the labor movement in West Virginia and then in the South. So, Keri Leigh, so they have this devastating loss, and they're remembered now as heroes and martyrs in the pursuit of a cause that was eventually more or less, obviously it's ongoing, but prevailed. So they had these 10, 15 years where basically they went back to their previous state of immiseration. Did organizing activity cease, or did it change form? Or before FDR came along, what happened during the rest of the 1920s and beginning of 1930s?
Well, that really depends which part of the South you look at. In a lot of the Deep South, especially the rural South, the 20s is actually a very, very radical time, especially when you get down into the cotton mills. And in Southern Appalachia, you have whites and Blacks banding together and literally forming communist organizations in some of these cotton mills.
Right.
And so it does get really, really radical. And this leads into kind of the 30s and 40s, where there's all sorts of red baiting going on. And anyone who's joining a labor organization in the South is immediately branded a communist. And of course, a race traitor communist for whites. And people are liable, again, not just to be prosecuted by the police, but literally shot down, hanged, lynched in many cases.
And you have figures like, I'm thinking of, and again, I'm drawing from memory, Keri Leigh, but the Reverend Claude Williams, and I think it was Alabama, who was a kind of radical preacher. And the story about Reverend Williams was that they were having an interracial meeting in his house, and they kept the shades drawn so that nobody could see. And the story is that Reverend Williams opened the shades, because of the obvious physical threat to all of them for meeting, and he threw open the shades and said, "Let them see how true followers of the Son of Man behave." So there, you had this kind of religious fervor around it. You had the communists very present in states like Alabama in the 1920s, but they weren't. Were they? Let me pose it as a question: were they making many inroads in terms of the actual treatment of workers in the South, or was it an ongoing struggle to get a foothold?
It was an ongoing struggle. They unfortunately did not, because as soon as they were, ascending kind of and their radicalism and then their banding together and kind of making it, more of a regional movement instead of just very local movements. That is, of course, exactly when the second Klan emerges, in the teens and the 20s. Right. And so much of this is against immigrant workers coming into the South, Catholics and Jews, but also it is against any kind of labor organizing. And again, this is the old Southern way passed down from slaveholders, is that you use violence, you use extremism, and you terrify everyone else into submission.
And, this may feel like a diversion, but as you were speaking, Keri Leigh, I was thinking of, and particularly regarding the racial dimension of it, I was thinking of Theodore Allen and his 2-volume work, The Invention of the White Race, that you really had these oppressed, poor, struggling white workers, and that by labeling them as white and giving them a white identity, it seemed like they were able to divide that population. Some people were radical and devoted to this kind of interracial organizing, but many people were, or at least that's my takeaway, my impression, many people clung to the notion of racism and racial superiority as a kind of consolation prize for their economic immiseration. And that helped the powers that be keep the situation going for some years longer. Is there any truth to that?
Oh, yes. I mean, that's exactly how they could do it, is through divide and conquer. And so, no matter how bad things would be for these poor whites, well, they would get the slightly better jobs in the factories. They would get slightly better wages than blacks. And so that was the way that they could always divide people that really had the same economic interests, that had the same labor interests. And it honestly is what they're still doing today.
Well, that's for sure. And then you have, 1932 comes. Franklin D. Roosevelt is elected. He is elected as a Democrat, so he has a party that includes the Southern Democrats, sort of representatives of a racist establishment, as well as Northern Democrats. He himself is very progressive, especially on economic issues. What happens then to the Southern labor movement?
So in a lot of ways, historians have conceptualized that the New Deal basically breaks up the Old South, that the Old South in its feudal type form, its plantation establishment, where inequality is absolutely huge, and a small cadre of rich, really descendants of slaveholders still run everything. They see the New Deal as finally breaking up that plantation feudalistic system because there's finally federal oversight into the way that employees are treated and the way that they're paid, into the hours that they work. There's some kind of federal oversight. And of course, this is mostly positive for people that are working in industries, and but for people that are working in farms, and especially for African American laborers and any kind of non-white laborers, it doesn't do a whole lot to change the kind of labor structure they're under. And it doesn't do a whole lot to improve any kind of access they have to any kind of political power or economic power. So it's a mixed bag. It really does bring the South in some ways into the modern era. But there's still a whole lot of these rural areas in the South where, I mean, you can still see the vestiges of slavery today, even today.
And when you say that, what are you picturing as vestiges of slavery?
Oh, I'm picturing, the Delta of Mississippi, where you can drive through and literally you see these old plantations and these little shacks where the sharecrop, it would have been an old sharecropper shack. Now it's the day laborers, right next to Parchment Farm, the biggest prison, one of the biggest prisons in the U.S., where it's literally a working plantation populated mostly, overwhelmingly by African Americans. And so you still see this carceral landscape in a lot of ways throughout the South.
And, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that there is still an element of white Southern culture that romanticizes that kind of gone with the wind style. I'm thinking, for example, of in my corporate life, maybe, 25 years ago, we had a retreat with our clients in Charleston, and we took a plantation tour, which a questionable choice to begin with. But I remember being in the tour bus and the tour guide, local woman, saying, well, people criticize the plantation system, but how else were you going to run a farm of this size? And so, of course, a friend of mine speaks up and says, collectivization, one possibility. He starts throwing out these subdivisions, but the fact is, at least a quarter of a century ago, there was still someone who felt comfortable saying in public to a group of people from around the country, well, how else were you going to run a farm of that size? As if like a farm of that size is a God-given right to begin with. But does that still linger?
Oh, sorry. I think, yes, especially among the upper class, really, and especially among people from outside the South who literally come to the South to get that kind of moonlight and magnolias, mythology, exactly, Gone with the Wind, everything from that to even to modern day depictions of what the Old South was like with hoop skirts and just this romanticization of something that never was, the kind of South that was depicted in those vestiges of pop culture. It was depicted that way for a very political purpose, to mask the bloodshed, to mask the worst place for laborers in the U.S. Still is the worst place for laborers. All of the anti-labor laws that have taken over the rest of the U.S. originated in the Deep South. And so what we're seeing in many ways, I know some people don't agree with this framing, but it is the Southernization of America in terms of the way we treat laborers. We are now down to about 6% of people being in unions. I live in a state in Georgia where we've almost never had unions. It has been illegal since I've been born in many ways to form unions in the state. And so, yes, the South's anti-labor stance has really kind of taken over America.
So when I used to hear people as a kid say the South's going to rise again, that's how it did it, I guess, is by, bring us down to the lowest common denominator. So let's talk about, Keri Leigh, about what happened after FDR. I mean, there are obviously advances in unionization with FDR. You also had rural electrification, Tennessee Valley Authority, Civilian Conservation Corps, and all that, giving jobs to people. But then World War II comes, and young men from all around the country are it becomes a dominant force in American life, economically and otherwise. Then in the post-war era, you have growth for some people in some places. People look back at it and think of it, imagine it as universal prosperity and growth. It hardly was that. But you still have, let's see, 1968. Bobby Kennedy goes to Appalachia and is horrified by what he sees. Now, if he'd ever been to Appalachia before, he shouldn't have been surprised if he had been following what was going on there. But, I take the accounts at their word that he was in fact shocked and surprised at the level of poverty there. And of course, he'd been Attorney General of the United States. So, but his brother was the president. So if he didn't know, most people still didn't know. So what happens then? Because if anything, I would say that the period 1960 to 19, well, first of all, you have Eisenhower in the 50s boasting that union membership increased in his presidency. Not something you'd see a Republican say today. Then you have JFK come in and Lyndon Johnson. But I would think that even though the poverty was such that Bobby Kennedy was moved to tears in 1968, that, if anything, might have been the high watermark for progress for labor and working people, given what followed: Nixon, Jimmy Carter, Reagan, most influentially, probably, so on. So where were we from the 60s and then onward for Southern labor?
You're right. It's unfortunately a real period of stagnation after Kennedy comes down and literally shows the rest of America that there are people, there are babies starving in Mississippi and Appalachia. Literally, yeah, like you said, brought to tears by seeing babies with distended bellies in Mississippi, like you would see in a starving country, and so. I see 68, like you do, as kind of this turning point where so many of the great luminaries are gone. And, really, I think the unfortunate thing is that the Poor People's Campaign that Martin Luther King is really, really starting in 68 doesn't really get off the ground after he's killed. And so that is one thing I'm very glad to see be resurrected in the last few years with Dr. Barber and the Poor People's Campaign. I think that the labor movement needs to get back to some sort of, not religious necessarily, but some sort of spiritual higher meaning about putting community first and taking care of each other. And I see, especially with what's happened last summer with the Black Lives Matter protests and really what's happened to the state of labor since the pandemic. We are ripe right now, or as a country, we're ripe for a huge labor movement, for a huge movement that embodies both civil rights and labor, because of course, as you know, you cannot separate those two issues. But the added burden right now is still being in the midst of this pandemic. How do you organize? How do you do what needs to be done politically, because you have so many people right now who are just struggling to know where they're going to eat next or where their rent check is going to come from. And so with so many people about to hit kind of rock bottom in terms of poverty, unless something happens major at a policy level, we're going to have to get creative about how to do this.
Particularly, Keri Leigh, to me anyway, because poverty can have one of two effects, it seems to me. One is it can be very disempowering because it just leads to discouragement and fatalism. And when you're struggling just to survive, you don't have that much energy for organizing or political action. But at the same time, it can also be a motivator, of course. And I don't mean to speak so dispassionately about it. I say this with tremendous compassion, but I mean, it's tough for people, and people need to work, as you say, together. I think, the secret of despair as a tool for oppression is making people think they're all alone in their suffering. And the counter to that is bringing people together to realize it's not their individual failings, it's the system, and they can work together to save it. And your point about the pandemic is well taken. But if we go back just to a couple years before the pandemic, 2 or 3, to me, one of maybe the most significant event in Southern labor rights since the 30s was the so-called red state teachers strike. To me, I'd love your thoughts, but to me, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, that these states that are considered conservative and Republican, that when these teachers walked out, and really my sense was their unions were scrambling to catch up with them. The teachers were not the management, were the leaders of this, that it strikes me that it was very popular among people who would not normally be categorized as lefties, quote unquote. And that one of the things they did that was compassionate and brilliant was strike not only for themselves, but for better supplies for their children, for all the other workers at schools, for corrections officers and so on in the prisons. So, and then it seemed to, there were some concessions, and then, for example, in West Virginia, they were kind of secretly undermined subsequently. But that to me was a hopeful sign, and I don't know where that's gone, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think teachers and teachers unions are going to be the thing to watch in the next year or two, because like you said, they have historically had success even in very red states, but especially given what the pandemic is doing to the profession itself, and really kind of gutting the profession in some ways, with veteran teachers, and really making a lot of other teachers, make choices none of us want to have to make, about their own health and the health of their families. And so, again, I think unless there's going to be some big major solution about how do we adequately compensate the people who are charged with what we keep claiming as a country is one of the most important jobs in the world. We claim that it's that, and then we don't treat them as such. We don't pay them as such. That I think there are going to be many, many more strikes. I mean, we already see people walking out right now, just walking out on the job, because they're not willing to put their health on the line for, $40,000, $50,000 a year. And I think we're going to continue seeing that happen across different industries. We've already seen it. One thing I think is being underreported is this huge de facto kind of general labor strike in the service industry right now.
I think that's such a great point. You hear people saying in the media and so on, well, we don't know why people aren't going back to work. We don't know what to do about it. Well, Economics 101 tells you what to do about it. You put more money on the table, you put more benefits on the table. They don't want to do that. So they treat it as an inexplicable phenomenon. You're absolutely right. It is a form of labor action. It's a form of saying we're not going to die so that you can get your Amazon delivery this morning, whatever it might be. And I think that's also a prominent sign. So let's hope that continues. And Keri, Leigh, before I let you go, if you could say, as a historian, as a writer, as a person who cares deeply about these issues, if you could say something to Northern liberals, for lack of a better term, about working people in the Deep South or in the South, what would you say to them?
I would say that the South is the most radical part of the nation. It's just that we're not allowed to let you all know about it because of the history of the region and the history of, anti-labor, anti-Black, anti-poor people. There is such a culture of censorship and a culture of making people have to stay within those lines, or they can lose everything. And we're down here. We're ready to go. We need support and help.
I love that. So I hope you come back soon and keep us posted on it. And again, Keri Leigh Merritt is a historian and writer based in Atlanta, and you can find her work at Keri Leigh Leigh Merritt Merritt.com, KeriLeighMerritt.com. So as always, Keri Leigh, it was a pleasure speaking with you, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much, and happy Labor Day.
And same to you. We'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to The Zero Hour.